Have you ever felt like you walked into a room and the air just changed? Like every eye was on you, not with curiosity, but with a silent, calculating skepticism. For many of us especially, in spaces we're told aren't for us, that feeling is a familiar echo. It's the silent judgment, the unspoken challenge, the weight of expectations laid upon you before you even say a word. But what if that quiet strength, that deep well of resilience you've cultivated, is exactly what makes you unshakable? What if the very thing they underestimate about you is your greatest power? Today we're sharing the story of Julian Clark, a man who simply wanted to learn. What happened next wasn't just a classroom skirmish. It was a profound lesson in the quiet power of standing your ground, a testament to the strength that lives in us all, especially when the world tries to tell you where you don't belong. This is a story about what happens when quiet brilliance meets loud arrogance, and why the calmest people are often the ones you should never test. The large lecture hall at the East Coast University buzzed with the low chatter of students settling into their seats, flipping through pages of worn-out notebooks, and unlocking their laptops. It was just another Tuesday morning in Professor Evelyn Thorne's advanced calculus class. She was a woman who commanded authority the moment she stepped into a room. Sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, and a no-nonsense gaze that could make even the most confident students shrink in their chairs. Thorne's reputation was built on precision and discipline. If you wanted to pass her class, you had to earn it. No shortcuts, no sympathy. Her rigidity, some whispered, stemmed from her own brutal climb in a male-dominated field, leaving her with little patience for perceived weakness. Today, she wasn't in the mood for nonsense. She strode to the front heels clicking against the tiled floor, and in one swift motion snapped a piece of chalk between her fingers. The room fell silent. "All right," she said, brushing a stray blonde hair from her face. "Last lecture we covered multivariable limits. Today we push forward, Laplace transforms." She turned to the board and began writing long, intricate equations sprawling across the surface in neat, perfect script. Students scrambled to take notes, some already lost in the symbols, others pretending to understand. Thorne thrived in this environment. The struggle, the pressure, the silent competition. She knew most students would flounder, and frankly, she preferred it that way. It reinforced the idea that only the truly gifted belonged in her world. At least that's what she thought. Somewhere near the middle of the hall, one student sat quietly tapping his pen against his notebook. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't panicking. If anything, he looked bored. His name was Julian Clark. Tall, lean, and always dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. Julian wasn't the type to draw attention. He rarely spoke in class, never made a spectacle of himself, but beneath that quiet demeanor, his mind worked faster than most. Numbers, patterns, equations. They made sense to him in a way they didn't for others. He glanced at the board, his eyes scanning the equation. Something was off. A small mistake, just a minor one, but a mistake nonetheless. Julian hesitated. He could let it go. No one else seemed to notice. But then again, if she caught the mistake later, she might double back and waste time correcting it. Before he could decide, another student raised a hand hesitantly. A girl in the front row. Professor Thorne, I think there's an error in the second line," she asked, her voice uncertain. The professor turned slowly, arching a brow. "An error," she repeated, as if the very idea was offensive. She scanned the board, then smirked. "There is no error," she said flatly. The girl's face turned red, and she quickly looked down embarrassed. Julian exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He hated this. The way some professors dismissed students the way they acted as if they were beyond making mistakes. It was a power dynamic he'd seen too often, especially against those who might already feel like they had to fight to be heard. And before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. "Actually," he said, his voice calm, "there is an error." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned. Thorne's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker just for a second of irritation in her eyes. "Oh," she said, arms crossing. "Enlighten me." Julian stood up, not out of arrogance, not to make a show of it. He just didn't like speaking from a seated position. "It's in the second step," he explained, pointing at the board. You applied the transformation to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer doesn't match the expected result. Silence. Thorne's jaw tensed. She turned back to the board, scanning her own work. And then there it was. The mistake. Her grip on the chalk tightened. For a moment, Julian thought she might just admit it and move on. But then her lips curled into a tight smile. Well, Mr. Clark, she said, turning to face him. Since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way? A few students chuckled under their breath. Julian could hear the unspoken message behind her words. She didn't want to acknowledge that he was right. She wanted to put him on the spot, make him hesitate, make him stumble. But that wasn't going to happen. Julian set down his notebook, walked calmly to the front of the room, and took the chalk from her hand. He wasn't going to hesitate, but Professor Thorne had no idea what she had just set in motion. Julian stepped up to the board, chalk in hand. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in. The silent expectations, the professor's gaze drilling into his back, the quiet murmurs from students, wondering if he was about to make a fool of himself. But he wasn't nervous. His calm was a practiced discipline honed not just in countless hours with equations, but in a world that often demands perfection from you just to be seen as equal. He knew this dance, this subtle push and pull, where competence was met with suspicion, especially when it came from someone who didn't fit the expected mold. This wasn't merely about correcting a math error. It was about Julian quietly, firmly shattering Professor Thorne's preconceived notions, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the incorrect part of the equation and rewrote it. His handwriting wasn't as neat as Thorne's, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the numbers, and they lined up perfectly. He spoke as he worked his voice even casual. The mistake was in how the transform was applied. You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changed the integral limits. But if you solve it this way, it keeps the function intact. The room was silent, except for the soft scratch of chalk against the board. He finished the equation, set the chalk down, and stepped back. Then he turned. Professor Thorne stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed together. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of a lecture hall full of students. Julian could see it in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss him, brush it off, maybe even find a way to twist the situation so that she still looked right. Instead, she took a slow breath, nodding curtly. Fine, she said. You corrected it. Congratulations. Some students exchanged glances. That was it. No acknowledgement. No actual praise. Julian didn't need it. He just returned to his seat, feeling the eyes of his classmates on him. Some were impressed. A few seemed irritated, probably the ones who thought he was showing off. But he wasn't. He just couldn't stand errors, especially ones that could have been avoided. Professor Thorne turned back to the board, wiping away his work. Let's move on, she said briskly. Since Mr. Clark is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge. Julian blinked. Excuse me. Thorne was already writing again. This time, a much longer equation. It sprawled across half the board, filled with integrals, limits, and a particularly tricky differential component. She finished the last symbol with a flourish and turned to face him. Since you have such a keen eye, she said, a chilling smile playing on her lips. Solve this. A few students shifted in their seats. Julian stared at the equation. He knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a normal question, not for this level. The complexity alone made it clear she didn't expect him to get it right. She expected him to hesitate, stumble over the steps, maybe get partway through before realizing he was in over his head. She wanted to prove that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was to put him back in his place. This was a common pitfall among those in power. When their initial biases are challenged, they often resort to harder tests, impossible standards, anything to regain control and reinforce the hierarchies they believe in. Julian exhaled through his nose. Fine. He stood again, walking back up to the board. A few students chuckled under their breath, clearly expecting him to struggle. Thorne smirked, stepping back and folding her arms. Take your time, she said. Julian didn't need time. He picked up the chalk and started writing. Not hesitating, not second-guessing, just solving. Every symbol, every number flowed from his mind to his hand effortlessly. He didn't even pause to think. His brain was already 5 steps ahead, visualizing the solution before his fingers had finished the previous line. The room grew quieter. The murmurs stopped. Professor Thorne's smirk faded. Halfway through the equation, Julian glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials instead of trigonometric functions." She didn't answer. He kept going a few more steps, a few simplifications, and then done. He underlined the final answer and turned around, casually, setting the chalk back on the tray. Silence. A deep, consuming silence. Then somewhere in the back, a single student let out a low whistle. Thorne's expression was unreadable. She scanned his work line by line, searching for an error, anything she could use to dismiss it. There was nothing. He had solved it not just correctly, but elegantly. The solution was clean, efficient. A few students started whispering, a few others leaning forward, clearly realizing what just happened. Julian crossed his arms. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just waiting. Professor Thorne finally spoke, her voice tighter than before. "Lucky guess." A few students laughed under their breath, though not at Julian. He tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't a guess." Thorne exhaled sharply through her nose. "Sit down, Mr. Clark," she muttered. Julian turned and walked back to his seat. He could feel the shift in the room, the way people were looking at him now, some with admiration, some with resentment. And one person, Professor Thorne, with something else entirely. But she wasn't done with him yet. The energy in the room had shifted. Julian could feel it. No one was looking at Professor Thorne the same way they had at the start of class. He hadn't set out to embarrass her. That wasn't his goal. But he also wasn't about to shrink just to make her comfortable. Thorne turned back to the board, but she was gripping the chalk tighter now. She continued with the lecture, but her words lacked the same edge of authority they usually carried. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. She turned back to the class, scanning the rows of students, and then her gaze landed back on him. "If you're so confident, Mr. Clark," she said, forcing a smile, "how about we raise the stakes?" A few students chuckled. Others leaned forward, sensing something was about to go down. Julian didn't react. "What do you mean?" Thorne walked over to her desk, pulling out a thick textbook. She flipped through the pages before stopping on a section deep into the book, far beyond what they had covered in class. She turned the book around so the class could see the dense equations on the page. "This," she said, tapping a particularly intimidating problem, "is from an advanced graduate-level course. Something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur rippled through the room. "But since you seem to have a natural talent for this, why don't you prove it?" She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Julian exhaled slowly. He could see what she was doing. This wasn't about math anymore. She wanted to break him. This wasn't a test of skill. It was a power move. She wanted to push him past his limit, make him struggle in front of everyone. Maybe he'd get part of the way through, hesitate, and then she'd step in, remind the class why she was the authority in the room. He could refuse. He didn't owe her this. But the way the students were watching him, the way some were waiting for him to back down, made his decision for him. He stood up. Thorne's smirk wavered for just a second. Julian walked to the front of the room. She handed him the textbook, but he didn't even look at it. He had already memorized the problem. Without a word, he picked up the chalk. He knew the strategy. She had pulled this trick before, picking something just out of reach to humble students who thought too highly of themselves. But she had miscalculated. Julian lived for problems like this. He started writing. His movements were controlled, deliberate. The problem was tough, no question about it, but tough didn't mean impossible. As he worked, the whispers in the room faded. The only sound was the chalk against the board. He didn't rush. He let each step unfold naturally, flowing from one equation to the next. Every simplification, every transformation. It was all leading to the inevitable answer. And then finally, he boxed the final result. He turned back to the class. Silence. Thorne's face was unreadable, but her clenched jaw, the stiff way she held herself. He knew. She had thought this would put him in his place. Instead, he had just made her look like a fool. A student in the back let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Yo, what? Even the students who had been skeptical were now staring at Julian differently. Thorne's hand twitched slightly at her side. She had to say something. She had to take back control of the room. You've skipped a step, she said, her voice clipped. Julian raised an eyebrow. No, I didn't. Her fingers curled slightly. Yes, you did. Julian turned back to the board, scanning the work. Then, without missing a beat, he pointed to a section near the middle. This step here where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition. That's what you're talking about. Thorne didn't answer. He nodded. I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward. The class was dead silent. Thorne's face was tightening by the second. Julian turned back to her. But if you'd like, I can write it out. The way he said it, it wasn't cocky. It wasn't even challenging. It was just matter of fact. And that made it worse. He wasn't trying to make her look bad. She was doing that to herself. Thorne inhaled sharply. No, that won't be necessary. She turned back to her desk, setting the textbook down a little harder than she needed to. Julian could feel the shift in the air. He had just turned the class against her. Professor Thorne wasn't going to let this end here. Her face composed, but her grip on the desk betraying her frustration, she scanned the room. Julian sat down, but he knew this wasn't over. The students, meanwhile, were still digesting what had just happened. Then a hand shot up from the second row. Professor, a student named Kevin, one of Thorne's usual favorites, leaned forward. If he got it right, doesn't that mean Julian just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that mean something? Thorne's lips pressed into a thin line. Kevin wasn't wrong, but admitting that would mean acknowledging that she had underestimated Julian. I never said it was impossible, she responded smoothly, only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate. There was something slippery about the way she said it, like she was already trying to rewrite what had happened. Julian let out a slow breath, staring at the desk in front of him. He wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need her approval. But the class did. They needed to see what was happening here. Another student raised their hand. So if he got it right, does that mean he should be in a more advanced class? Thorne didn't answer right away. She glanced at Julian. For a moment, there was something else in her eyes. A calculation. Then finally, she smiled. I think, she said, her voice softer now, Mr. Clark would benefit from an academic challenge. The murmurs started again. Julian frowned. What kind of competition? Thorne walked to her desk, pulling out a folder. She flipped it open, scanning the papers inside. There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium coming up next month. Some of the best students from different schools in the region will be competing. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment. Not just about solving problems, but about doing it under time constraints with an audience. She looked up, eyes locking onto his. I assume you'd be up for it. Julian immediately understood what she was doing. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a setup. She wasn't just testing his math skills anymore. She was testing his ability to handle pressure to see if he could perform outside the safety of a classroom. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the best minds in the field. He could feel the weight of the room. People were waiting for his answer. If he backed down now, it would look like he had gotten lucky today that he wasn't actually as capable as he seemed. And if he accepted, he'd have to win. Julian exhaled, then nodded once. I'm in. Thorne's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Excellent. But she wasn't finished with him yet. The news spread fast. By the time Julian stepped out of the lecture hall, students were already whispering about it in the hallways. A few nodded at him with newfound respect. Others looked at him the way people look at an athlete about to enter a championship game. Curious, expectant, waiting to see if he'd live up to the hype. Julian barely paid attention. He had bigger things to focus on. The symposium was in 4 weeks. That meant he had 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that people spent months, sometimes years, training for. That night, he sat in the campus library, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks filled with calculations, and a half-empty coffee cup that had long gone cold. He had always loved math, but this was different. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was personal. He thought about his grandmother, who always told him, "Your mind is a gift, Julian. Don't let anyone make you feel small for it." He thought about every time he'd seen a black student dismissed every subtle slight. This was for them. This was for him. Burning the midnight oil already. Julian looked up to see Kevin standing by his table, hands in his pockets. He shrugged. "Gotta be ready." Kevin smirked, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "Dude, you're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things. Thorne's just pissed that you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this." Julian leaned back in his chair. "I know." Kevin studied him for a second. "So, why do it?" Julian thought about that for a moment. He had asked himself the same thing more than once. He didn't need to prove anything. He could have walked away, let the moment pass. But he also knew how people like Thorne operated. If he backed down, she'd use it as confirmation. She'd find a way to frame it, say that he was talented but not disciplined enough, intelligent but not ready for real challenges. She would make sure that's what people remembered. Julian wasn't going to let that happen. "Because she expects me to lose," he finally said, "and I want her to be wrong." Kevin grinned. "Now that I can respect." The clock was ticking. The grand equation was about to begin. 4 weeks later, Julian stood in a large auditorium-style lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania, staring at the panel of judges and the long digital timer displayed above the stage. Competitors sat in assigned seats, their desks filled with scratch paper pens, and one simple directive: solve the problems faster and more accurately than everyone else. Professor Thorne was in the audience. She hadn't spoken to him much leading up to this. No encouragement, no advice. Just a polite nod when they arrived, as if she were a mere observer instead of the person who had thrown him into this. Julian knew what she was waiting for. She wanted to see if he'd crack. The timer started. He didn't. The first round was mental math-solving problems without writing anything down. While some competitors hesitated, Julian's hands moved without pause, punching numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could verify them. He was in his element. A silent symphony of numbers and logic playing out in his mind. The second round was theoretical application, breaking down concepts into proofs. Here, his natural intuition took over. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were patterns, rhythm structures that built upon one another. He wrote with the confidence of someone who didn't just understand the rules, but felt the very pulse of mathematics. The third round was speed solving. This was where most people tripped up. Pressure could make even the best students second-guess themselves. But Julian thrived under pressure. He kept going, ignoring the murmurs as his name crept higher and higher on the leaderboard. By the final round, there were only 2 competitors left in serious contention: Julian and a seasoned PhD candidate from MIT. The last problem appeared on the screen. It was brutal. Layers of integrals nested within summations, a problem designed to test not just knowledge, but endurance. Julian's pulse steadied. He exhaled, picked up his pen, and started writing. But what happened next, no one saw coming. The clock ticked down the final seconds, stretching like an eternity. Julian's fingers gripped the pen, his mind running through the layers of the problem faster than he could write. Every part of the equation had to be perfect. No shortcuts, no miscalculations. He could hear the faint scribbling of his competitor next to him, the MIT PhD candidate, who was just as determined. They were neck and neck, each racing to finish first. Julian's heart pounded, but his thoughts were clear. He saw the pattern, the shortcut no one else would see. And that was it. His hand moved faster, slashing through the numbers, simplifying expressions in ways most students wouldn't even think of. He didn't need to double-check. He knew. Final answer. He boxed it and set his pen down. The timer buzzed. Julian looked up, his breathing steady. His competitor was still writing. The room was dead silent. Then one of the judges stood up, walking over to examine both answers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. After a long pause, the judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Julian Clark. The room erupted. Some students clapped, some let out audible gasps, but Julian didn't react right away. He just exhaled, letting the reality of it sink in. He had won. Not just against the other students, but against the expectations placed on him, against the professor who had doubted him, against the unspoken assumptions that had tried to define him before he had the chance to define himself. Professor Thorne was motionless in the crowd. Julian met her gaze for the first time since he'd finished the problem. She looked unsure, like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Julian didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. He had let the numbers speak for themselves. This wasn't about a sudden epiphany for Professor Thorne, but a crack in the foundation of her deeply held beliefs about who belonged and who didn't. The next morning, Julian walked into class, taking his usual seat. Thorne entered a few minutes later, just as composed as always. But this time when she scanned the room, her gaze landed on him with something different respect. She cleared her throat. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium." The room fell quiet. Julian Clark took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. She continued, her voice even. "That is no small achievement." A few students clapped. Kevin shot Julian a knowing grin. Thorne turned back to the board and with that said, "Let's begin." That was it. No over-the-top praise, no long speech, just an acknowledgement. And somehow, that meant more than anything else. Because Julian hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something to himself, and he had. His victory resonated beyond just his personal achievement, impacting the perception of every talented black student in that environment. Julian Clark continued his studies with the same quiet dedication. But the world around him had irrevocably changed. His victory at the symposium wasn't just a win in a math competition. It was a ripple effect, a quiet revolution in the halls of academia. Professors who once barely noticed him now sought his input, offering research opportunities and advanced program invitations that had previously seemed out of reach. He accepted some, politely declined others, always staying true to his own path, his own purpose. He wasn't seeking fame or grand gestures. He was simply pursuing his passion with the same unwavering resolve that had defined him all along. His story became a beacon, showing that true success isn't always about the loudest applause, but about quietly excelling and opening doors, not just for yourself, but for the future. Professor Thorne, for her part, never offered a formal apology. But Julian saw the subtle shift in her eyes, in her occasional thoughtful nod when he asked a particularly insightful question. There was a newfound respect, a recognition that went beyond the numbers on a page. She continued to be a rigorous professor. But perhaps, just perhaps, her harshness now held a sliver more of genuine challenge, less of inherent skepticism. It was a testament to the fact that while deeply ingrained biases don't disappear overnight, they can begin to crack when confronted with undeniable truth. Julian's story is a powerful reminder that your talent doesn't need permission to shine. It doesn't need to be validated by those who seek to dim your light or define your potential. When you face skepticism, prejudice, or someone trying to put you in a box, remember Julian Clark. Remember that the undeniable truth of your ability is the most potent weapon against any doubt. Your resilience, your intellect, your unique perspective. These are your superpowers. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't belong, or that your genius isn't welcome. Just like Julian, sometimes the most profound statements are made without a single word, simply by showing up, doing the work, and letting your brilliance speak for itself. If Julian's story resonated with you, if it ignited that spark of brilliance within your own spirit, give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear this lesson about overcoming doubt and standing firm in their truth. And in the comments below, tell us, what is your undeniable equation? What's a time you proved someone wrong with your actions, not just your words? Let's build a community of quiet warriors reminding each other that sometimes the most powerful statements are made without a single word. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, empower, and remind us of the incredible strength that lives within us all.